The year was 1878, and the wind that swept across the high plains of Wyoming had a voice. It was a lonely, keening sound that scraped against the weathered planks of Cora's shack, a constant reminder of the vast emptiness that surrounded her. The shack itself was a testament to resilience, a small, stubborn knot of humanity tied against the endless roll of sagebrush and sky. It had been her father's, then her parents', and now, for 3 years, it was just hers. Cora was a creature of silence. It was not merely that she lived alone, miles from the nearest neighbor and a full day's ride from the raw settlement of Providence. The silence was inside her, a locked room in her soul where her voice had been stored away since the day she had watched the fever take her mother and grief take her father a season later. The world had become a place of sharp edges and loud, terrifying noises, and her silence had become her only shield. At 17, she was small for her age, with hair the color of dried corn silk and eyes the color of a stormy sky, perpetually wide as if still witnessing a tragedy she could not unsee. Her days were a rhythm of survival, a quiet liturgy of chores dictated by the sun and the seasons. In the thin light of dawn, she would break the ice in the water barrel, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She would check the few snares she had set for rabbits, her small hands deft and sure as she handled the wires. Most days they were empty, and her stomach would clench with a familiar, dull ache. She would spend hours mending her father's worn coat, stitching patches over patches until it was more thread than fabric, or grinding the last of her flour to make a thin, tasteless biscuit. Her world was one of textures and scents, the rough bark of the firewood, the sharp smell of pine, the dusty scent of the dry earth, the metallic tang of snow on the wind. Sounds were muted, distant the caw of a raven, the skittering of a mouse in the walls, the relentless sighing of the wind. It was a life whittled down to its barest essentials, a life of profound and aching isolation. She did not feel sorry for herself. Self-pity was a luxury she could not afford. She simply existed, a ghost haunting the edges of her own life, the silence her only companion. The landscape was her constant witness. It was a harsh and unforgiving place, where the winters were brutal and the summers were a fury of heat and dust. But there was a stark beauty to it that Cora understood in her bones. She knew the way the light fell across the canyons at dusk, painting them in shades of bruised purple and deep orange. She knew the scent of rain on the air long before the first drop fell. The land did not judge her silence. It did not demand a voice she could not give. It simply was, vast and indifferent and eternal, and in its presence, her own small sorrow felt both magnified and insignificant. She was a part of its unforgiving fabric, a single, silent thread woven into its grand and lonely tapestry. One afternoon, with the sky the color of lead and the promise of an early snow sharp in the air, Cora ventured farther than usual to check a line of snares she had set in a rocky drawer. The rabbits had been scarce, and a gnawing hunger drove her to push her boundaries. The wind was a physical force, tearing at her thin dress and whipping strands of hair across her face. She moved with the quiet purpose of a wild thing, her eyes scanning the ground, her senses alert. She found the snare empty, the wire dangling uselessly. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. It was in that moment of defeat, as she knelt to reset the trap, that she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the wind or the land, a low groan, like the sound of a great tree splintering under its own weight. Fear, sudden and electric, shot through her. Her first instinct was to flee, to retreat to the known safety of her shack. She was a girl alone, and the world was full of dangers she knew only from her father's cautionary tales. But something held her rooted to the spot. It was a sound of pure agony, a sound that transcended language and spoke directly to the bruised and tender part of her heart that still remembered what it was to feel for another. Slowly, cautiously, she rose and moved toward the sound. She crept through a thicket of gnarled juniper, her heart hammering against her ribs, and then she saw him. He was lying at the base of a rock outcropping, half hidden by the shadows. He was a Cheyenne man, his heritage plain in the high plains of his face, his long black hair, and the beaded leather of his leggings. But the finery was ruined, stained dark with blood. A deep, ragged gash ran across his ribs, and another wound marred his shoulder. His face, etched with lines of authority and strength, was pale and tight with pain. He was not old, perhaps 30 winters, but in that moment he looked ancient, like a fallen monument. A magnificent horse, a paint with intelligent eyes, stood nearby, its reins trailing on the ground, nuzzling its master's still hand, as if trying to wake him. The ingrained fear of her time, the stories of savage warriors and brutal raids whispered in Providence, screamed at her to run. He was the other, the danger her father had warned her about. But as she watched, another groan tore from his lips, and his body shuddered. In his eyes, as they flickered open and met hers, she did not see a savage. She saw a man, wounded and dying, a man as alone in his pain as she was in her silence. His gaze held no malice, only a dazed confusion and a flicker of defiance that even injury could not extinguish. A war raged within her. The part of her that had survived through caution and isolation urged her to leave him to his fate. It was not her fight. Helping him could bring untold trouble down upon her. But the part of her that remembered her mother's gentle hands, the part that knew the bitter sting of abandonment, could not turn away. To leave him here was to surrender to the very cruelty that had shattered her own world. Her decision was not a thought, but an action. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs, and stepped out from the cover of the junipers. The paint horse tossed its head and shied away, but the man's eyes remained fixed on her. She approached slowly, her hands held open and empty, to show she meant no harm. Kneeling beside him, she saw the severity of the wounds up close. They looked like bullet wounds. He was burning with fever, his skin hot to the touch. He would not survive the night out here, not with the snow coming. He was a heavy man, built of solid muscle and bone, and she was wiry and small. Getting him to the shack seemed an impossible task, but desperation gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. She managed to get him to lean on her, his arm draped over her shoulder, his weight a staggering burden. With the horse following placidly behind, she began the slow, agonizing journey back to her home. Each step was a monumental effort, his groans of pain mixing with her own ragged breaths. The world narrowed to the few feet of ground in front of her, the sinking sun, and the heavy, wounded man who was now her responsibility. By the time she half-dragged, half-carried him through the door of her shack, the first snowflakes had begun to drift from the bruised and darkening sky. The interior of the shack was suddenly and shockingly small. The space, which had always felt empty and vast with her loneliness, was now crowded with his presence. He was a piece of the wild, untamed land brought indoors, and his pain and fever seemed to suck the very air from the room. She eased him onto her own narrow cot, the only soft place in the entire structure, and he collapsed onto the thin mattress with a shuddering sigh, his eyes closing. For a moment, Cora stood frozen, the magnitude of what she had done crashing down on her. She had brought a stranger, a wounded warrior, an unknown danger, into the heart of her sanctuary. The silence was different now. It was no longer the empty silence of solitude, but the heavy, charged silence of two people in a confined space, separated by a gulf of culture, language, and fear. But there was no time for regret. His breathing was shallow, and the bleeding from his side had started afresh. Shaking off her fear, she moved with practiced economy. She stoked the fire in the small stone hearth until it blazed, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She put a pot of water on to boil, the hiss and bubble a comforting domestic sound in the tense quiet. From a small wooden chest, she took her mother's things, clean linen rags, a needle and thread, and a small tin of herbal salve that smelled of pine and yarrow. These were her most precious possessions, the last tangible links to a life of love and care. She gently cut away the blood-stiffened leather of his shirt. The wounds were ugly. One bullet had torn through the flesh of his shoulder, but the other looked worse, lodged deep in his side. She knew nothing of removing bullets, but she knew about cleaning wounds and stopping bleeding. With a basin of hot water and the clean rags, she began to wash away the blood and grime. Her touch was hesitant at first, then grew steady. He awoke during the process, his body tensing. His dark eyes, sharp with pain and suspicion, flew open and locked onto her. He made a move to sit up, a hostile growl rumbling in his chest. Cora froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She held up her hands, showing him the clean cloth and the basin, her expression pleading. She had no words to explain, no way to tell him she was trying to help. She could only hope he would understand. He stared at her for a long, breathless moment. He was assessing her, his gaze intense and piercing, as if he could see right through her skin and into the silent, frightened chambers of her heart. He saw not a threat, but a slip of a girl with haunted eyes and hands that trembled slightly but did not stop their work. Slowly, with a visible effort of will, he relaxed his body back onto the cot. He did not trust her, not yet, but he was granting her a reprieve. She worked for over an hour, cleaning the wounds as best she could, packing them with the healing salve, and binding them tightly with strips of linen. He bore the pain with a stoicism that stunned her, his jaw tight, his knuckles white, where he gripped the edge of the cot, but not another sound escaped his lips. When she was finished, he was slick with sweat, his face pale, but his breathing seemed a little easier. Exhausted, she sat back on her heels. The snow was falling heavily now, a thick, white curtain that sealed them off from the rest of the world. The wind howled, rattling the single glass pane in the small window. He was shivering, the fever and the cold working on him. Cora looked at him, then at her own thin blanket folded at the end of the cot. It was her only one, a patchwork of wool and flannel that had kept her from freezing on countless winter nights. It was the barrier between her and the brutal cold. Without a second thought, she picked it up. It smelled of wood smoke and of her. She unfolded it and gently laid it over him, tucking it carefully around his broad shoulders. He opened his eyes again, his gaze following the movement. He looked at the blanket, then at her. He saw her thin dress, saw her shiver as a draught snaked through a crack in the wall. He understood the sacrifice. It was a gift of immense value, an offering of warmth and life itself. For the first time, the suspicion in his eyes softened, replaced by something else, something deeper. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, a fragile bridge of understanding built across the silent chasm between them. That night, Cora slept on the hard floor by the fire, wrapped in her father's threadbare coat, listening to the man's breathing and the storm raging outside. She was colder than she had ever been, but she was not entirely alone. The following days unfolded in a slow, quiet rhythm. The snowstorm raged for 2 days and nights, cocooning the small shack in a world of white and wind. Inside, a strange, unspoken truce settled between its two inhabitants. Cora moved about her chores, tending the fire, melting snow for water, and checking on her patient. He remained on the cot, mostly sleeping, his body locked in a fierce battle against the fever and the infection. She would spoon thin broth made from dried herbs and a precious bit of salt pork into his mouth when he was lucid, and she would bathe his face with cool water when the fever rose. His name, she would learn much later, was Moketavato, a name that carried great weight among the Cheyenne people. He was a chief, a leader, not of war, but of peace, a man struggling to guide his people through a changing and hostile world. The bullets that had torn through his flesh had come from the rifle of a whiskey trader whose poisoned goods he had forbidden from his camp. He had been ambushed, left for dead, and had ridden until his strength had finally given out in the rocky draw where Cora had found him. But in the shack, he was not a chief. He was simply a man, stripped of his power and authority, utterly dependent on the kindness of a silent, solitary girl. He watched her constantly. He saw the worn-out soles of her shoes, the careful way she rationed their meager food supply, the deep sadness that lived in her eyes. He saw her strength, a quiet, enduring force like the prairie grass that bends in the wind but never breaks. He noted that she never spoke, not even to herself. He saw her flinch at loud noises, the way she would wrap her arms around herself as if to hold her own broken pieces together. On the third day, the fever broke. Mokotavato awoke to find the shack filled with the pale, clean light of a sunlit snowfield. His head was clear for the first time in days. The pain in his side was a sharp, clean fire instead of a dull, consuming blaze. Cora was sitting by the hearth, carefully sharpening her father's skinning knife with a whetstone. She looked up and saw that he was awake and truly seeing her. She rose and brought him a cup of water. As he drank, his eyes met hers over the rim of the tin cup. He handed it back to her, and their fingers brushed. The brief contact was like a spark, a jolt of shared humanity. He gestured toward his wounds, then to her, a clear question in his eyes. She understood. She pulled back the blanket and lifted the edge of the linen bandage. The angry redness around the wound had subsided. It was beginning to heal. A look of relief passed over his face, followed by one of profound gratitude. Their communication became a silent language of gestures and expressions. He would point to the water bucket, and she would refill it. She would hold up a rabbit she had finally caught in a snare, and he would nod in approval. The loneliness that had been Cora's constant companion began to recede, replaced by a sense of shared existence. The silence in the shack was no longer empty. It was filled with a quiet understanding, a mutual respect growing in the space where words would have been. A week after she found him, he was strong enough to sit up for longer periods. One afternoon, Cora struggled to haul a heavy log inside for the fire. She was straining, her small frame no match for its weight. Before she could drop it, Mokotavato was there. He moved slowly, his face tight with the effort, but he took the other end of the log. Together, they carried it inside and placed it by the hearth. It was a simple act, but it marked a profound shift. He was no longer just her patient. They were partners in the small, demanding enterprise of survival. He began to contribute in small ways. He showed her how to better fletch an arrow for hunting. He took a piece of firewood and, with Cora's small knife, began to carve. For hours, he would sit by the fire, the shavings falling around him, his concentration absolute. He was carving a horse, its head thrown back, its mane flowing. The detail was exquisite, the creature imbued with a spirit of wild freedom. When he was finished, he held it out to her. Cora took it, her fingers tracing the smooth, carved lines. It was beautiful, a perfect replica of the proud animal that was now healing in the small lean-to she had built against the shack. She looked at him, her eyes shining with an emotion she had not felt in years. She turned and walked to her small chest. From beneath a pile of mended clothes, she took out a small, oval frame. It held a faded photograph of a smiling man and woman, their arms around each other. Her parents. She had never shown it to anyone. She held it out to him. Mokotavato took the photograph with a reverence that surprised her. He studied the faces, then looked at Cora. Seeing the resemblance, he saw her heritage, her loss. He handed it back gently, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. In that moment, they were not a white girl and a Cheyenne chief. They were two people who had known profound grief, two souls who had found a moment of quiet communion in a world that had tried to break them both. He had seen her past, and she had seen the artist in him. The walls between them had crumbled into dust. The settlement of Providence was less a town and more a raw wound on the face of the prairie. It consisted of a single dusty street lined with a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a handful of ramshackle houses. It was a place for men who had come west to escape their pasts or to gouge a fortune from the land, and it simmered with a brew of suspicion, greed, and boredom. Garrett Shaw was a product of this environment, A trapper with a mean disposition and a proprietary view of the territory, he considered any land he walked on to be his. He had known of the orphan girl in the old Hale shack, viewing her with a mixture of pity and contempt. An unmarried woman living alone was an affront to the natural order of things in his mind. A fortnight after the storm, Shaw was checking his trap lines when he cut the tracks. They were faint in the melting snow, but unmistakable. The tracks of a shod horse, and beside them the distinct print of a Cheyenne moccasin. His eyes narrowed, he followed them, his curiosity piqued, his instincts on high alert. The tracks led him into the draw not far from the Hale place. He found the signs of a struggle, a patch of ground stained with dried blood. The tracks then led directly toward Cora's shack. He didn't approach the shack directly. Instead, he circled around, using the terrain for cover. Hidden in a stand of aspen, he raised his spyglass. He saw the girl, Cora, throwing a bucket of dirty water out the door. That was normal. What was not normal was the paint horse, a fine animal of clear Cheyenne breeding, sheltered in the lean-to. As he watched, the shack door opened again, and a man stepped out into the sun, stretching his arms. It was the Cheyenne warrior. He moved stiffly, like a man recovering from injury, but he was undeniably there. At the girl's home, a dark, ugly poison filled Shaw's mind. He saw not a man recovering from injury, but a savage who had taken advantage of a helpless girl. He imagined the worst, his mind painting lurid pictures fueled by prejudice and fear. He lowered the spyglass, his face a mask of grim certainty. He knew what he had to do. He was a protector of civilization, a guardian against the wilderness and its perceived dangers. He rode hard for Providence, his horse kicking up slush and mud. He burst into the saloon, the only gathering place the town offered, and the low murmur of conversation ceased. All eyes turned to him. "There's a Cheyenne buck holed up at the Hale place," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "The orphan girl, she's with him. I saw it myself." A wave of unease and excitement rippled through the room. Men who spent their days in back-breaking labor or mind-numbing boredom were suddenly alive with purpose. "Are you sure, Garrett?" asked the storekeeper, a nervous man named Miller. "Saw him with my own eyes," Shaw insisted, his voice rising. "He's a warrior, I can tell, probably wounded from some raid, and he's got that girl trapped in there. Lord knows what he's done to her, or what he plans to do to us when he's healed up." He played on their deepest fears of attack, fears for their women, fears of the vast, unknown land and the people who had been there first. He painted Cora not as a compassionate soul, but as a victim, a foolish girl whose actions now endangered them all. "We can't just leave him there," one man shouted. "He'll bring others," another added. "A whole war party." The fear, fanned by Shaw's certainty, quickly turned to anger. It was a righteous anger, the kind that feels like courage. They were not a mob, they were protectors. They were not driven by prejudice, they were driven by necessity. Within the hour, Garrett Shaw had gathered a posse of 12 men. They were farmers, prospectors, and drifters, armed with old rifles, shotguns, and a shared, ugly sense of purpose. They rode out of Providence as the sun began to sink low in the sky, a grim procession heading for the lonely shack on the plains, ready to deliver their own brutal form of justice. The sound of approaching horses reached Cora first. It was a rhythmic thudding that vibrated up from the frozen ground, an alien sound in her quiet world. She was outside, scattering the last of her chicken feed, when she heard it. Mokatavato, who was splitting kindling with slow, deliberate strokes, heard it too. He straightened up, his head cocked, his expression instantly hardening. He looked at Cora, and she saw in his eyes the same alarm that was clutching at her own heart. They saw them then, a dark line of riders cresting the nearest ridge, silhouetted against the blood orange of the sunset. They were not traveling leisurely, they rode with grim intent. Cora's blood ran cold. She knew, with a dreadful certainty, who they were and why they were coming. Inside, Moketavato's voice was a low rasp, one of the first words he had spoken in her presence. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the shack. His strength had largely returned, and he moved with a fluid grace, all signs of the near-dead man she had found now gone. He pushed her behind him as he barred the door, then moved to the single window, peering out through a crack in the shutter. Cora's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she felt sick. The posse of a dozen men surrounded the small cabin, their faces hard and unyielding in the fading light. Garrett Shaw dismounted, his rifle held loosely in his hands. "Cora Hale," he yelled, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "You in there? Come on out now. We know you ain't alone." Cora shrank back, pressing herself against the wall. Moketavato glanced at her, his face calm, but his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. He picked up the heavy iron poker from the hearth. It was a poor weapon against a dozen rifles, but he held it as if it were a warrior's lance. "We don't want to hurt you, girl," Shaw called out again, his voice taking on a wheedling, patronizing tone. "We're here to help you. Just send out the savage, and we'll leave you be." The word savage struck Cora like a blow. They were talking about the man who had carved a beautiful horse for her, the man who had shared his story of loss through a simple look, the man who had helped her carry firewood when he could barely stand. The fear that had held her captive for so long began to burn away, replaced by a hot, bright flame of anger. Moketavato made a move toward the door, ready to face them, to die fighting if he must. But Cora put a hand on his arm, stopping him. She shook her head fiercely. This was her home. These were her people, her kind, and they were the ones bringing the violence. She would not hide behind him. She took a deep, shuddering breath, unbarred the door, and stepped outside. She stood on the small porch, a small, defiant figure in a worn dress, blinking in the twilight. She pulled the door closed behind her, shielding Moketavato from their view. Shaw smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "That's a good girl. Now, just step aside and tell your friend to come out with his hands empty." Cora stood her ground. She looked at the faces of the men she had seen in Providence, men who had ignored her or looked through her. Now they were all staring at her, their eyes filled with suspicion and menace. She shook her head, a single sharp motion. Shaw's smile vanished. "Don't be a fool, girl. He's filled your head with lies. He's a danger to all of us. Now, get out of the way." Again, Cora shook her head. Her body was trembling, but her resolve was a column of iron within her. For the first time since her parents died, she was not running. She was not hiding. She was standing for something, for someone. "Last chance," Shaw growled, raising his rifle. The other men followed suit, the sound of a dozen rifles being cocked echoing in the tense silence. It was in that moment that the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind died down. The birds fell silent. A new sound began, a sound so deep and pervasive it seemed to come from the earth itself. It was the sound of 1,000 hoofbeats, a soft, drumming thunder that grew steadily louder. Every man in the posse turned, their faces, confident just a moment before, turned slack with disbelief and then stark terror. Over the ridge where they had come, and the next ridge, and the one after that, figures appeared. They were not a war party, they were a nation on the move. Warriors on horseback, their faces painted not for war but with solemn purpose, lined the crests of the hills, their forms dark against the last light of day. There were hundreds of them, their numbers swelling until it seemed as if the very hills had given birth to a silent, implacable army. 1,000 warriors, maybe more, sitting on their horses, watching the scene below. They held bows, lances, and rifles, but they made no move to attack. They simply waited, their presence a weight that crushed the air, a silent, overwhelming testament to the power and reach of the man inside the shack. The door opened behind Cora. Moketavato stepped out beside her. He was no longer just a man, he was a chief. He stood tall, his gaze sweeping over the posse with cold authority before rising to meet the eyes of his people on the hills. He raised a hand, and on the ridge, a lone warrior raised a lance in reply. Garrett Shaw stared, his mouth agape. The righteous anger, the courage born of fear and ignorance, all of it evaporated, leaving only a cold, primal dread. He and his men were not a posse of protectors. They were a handful of insignificant gnats threatening a great eagle. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been annihilated. He looked from the silent, watching army to the chief standing beside the small, mute girl, and for the first time, he understood the catastrophic nature of his mistake. Slowly, clumsily, he lowered his rifle. The other men, their faces ashen, did the same. Without another word, Shaw turned, mounted his horse, and spurred it into a frantic retreat. The rest of the posse scrambled to follow, fleeing not from a battle, but from the sheer, terrifying weight of their own insignificance. They vanished over the plains, a scattered and broken group, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The silence that descended after the posse fled was deeper than any Cora had ever known. It was a silence of awe and reverence. The 1,000 warriors remained on the ridges, a silent ring of mountains that had risen to protect their own. They were a testament not to violence, but to loyalty and love for their leader. A handful of warriors detached themselves from the silent host and rode down to the shack. They dismounted with quiet dignity, their faces stern but their eyes holding deep relief as they looked upon their chief. They spoke to Moketavato in the fluid, melodic tones of the Cheyenne language. He answered them, his voice calm and full of command. When he was done, he turned to Cora. The setting sun cast a final, golden light upon them, and in that glow, the chasm between their two worlds seemed to disappear. He stood before her, not as a patient or a refugee, but as the great chief his people knew him to be. Yet, when he looked at her, his eyes were filled with a humility and gratitude that transcended all status. He placed his right hand over his heart, then extended his open palm toward her. It was not a gesture of farewell, but one of profound respect, an acknowledgement of a debt that could never be fully repaid. He had no words in her language to express what she had done, but none were needed. In his gaze, she saw it all. His thanks for her courage, her compassion, her sacrifice. She had not just saved his life, she had honored his humanity when his own people could not find him, and hers would have destroyed him. One of the warriors came forward and gently laid a large bundle wrapped in tanned deer hide at her feet. Then, with a final, meaningful look, Moketavato mounted the fresh horse his men had brought him. He sat tall and proud, a leader reunited with his people. He led them away, not back the way they had come, but west, toward the heart of their own lands. The sea of warriors on the hills turned and followed, flowing like a great river across the landscape, until the last rider had dipped below the horizon, leaving the plains as empty and quiet as they had been before. Cora stood alone in the twilight, the air cold on her cheeks. She was alone again, but the quality of her solitude had been forever changed. The silence that filled her small shack was no longer the oppressive weight of loneliness, but the tranquil quiet of peace. She knelt and untied the bundle. Inside were things of unimaginable value to her: thick, warm buffalo and beaver furs, a large bladder of dried berries and jerky, a new skinning knife with a carved bone handle, and a finely wrought fire striker. It was a gift of survival, a promise that she would not face the coming winter alone and unequipped. She took the warmest of the furs, a magnificent buffalo robe, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of smoke and sage, and a world she had only just touched. She stood in the doorway of her home, looking out at the vast, star-dusted sky. The wind had picked up again, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like a whisper, a story of an orphan girl who had been taught to fear, but had chosen to love. Her voice was still locked away, but her spirit was no longer silent. She had faced down a mob, been sheltered by an army, and had forged a bond of respect with a chief. She was no longer just a forgotten remnant of a tragic past. She was Cora Hale, the girl who had given her only blanket to a stranger and, in return, had been given back a world of hope. In the vast, unforgiving wilderness, she had found her own kind of strength, her own kind of connection, and in the quiet of her own heart, she had finally found a home. The year was 1887, and the silence in the parsonage was a physical thing. It had weight and texture, a smothering quality like the dust cloths Esther Hale had draped over her father's theological texts. 3 months had passed since the town of Providence Creek had buried the Reverend Michael Hale, and the silence he left behind was louder than any sermon he had ever preached. It echoed in the empty rooms, clung to the tall, stark furniture, and settled deep in Esther's bones, a cold companion to the Dakota autumn that was bleeding the color from the world outside. Her life had become a litany of quiet, repetitive tasks. She rose before the sun painted the eastern plains in pale, watery shades of rose and gray. She tended the small vegetable patch, her hands chapped from the lye soap and the increasingly sharp wind. She baked her bread, the scent of yeast a lonely ghost in the cavernous kitchen. She mended linens, her stitches small and perfect, a testament to a discipline that felt more like a cage than a virtue. The townspeople watched her. From behind their lace curtains and over the tops of their general store ledgers, they watched. They saw the preacher's daughter, a figure of somber piety, a living monument to her father's unbending righteousness. They did not see the woman drowning in the quiet. Her father had been a man carved from granite and gospel, his voice a booming instrument of judgment that could make the most stalwart sinner tremble. He had loved her in his way, a severe, demanding love that equated obedience with affection. He had shaped her, molded her, and left her with a legacy of expectations she could neither fulfill nor escape. Now, at 24, she was an orphan, a spinster, living on the charity of a congregation that pitied her but did not understand her. The parsonage was hers only until the new preacher arrived from back east, a deadline that hung over her like a guillotine. Loneliness was not new to her, but this strain of it was different. It was an isolation that went deeper than the mere absence of people. It was a disconnect from herself. Who was she, without her father's shadow to stand in? She would sometimes catch her reflection in the dark glass of the window, at twilight, a pale, serious face, hair pulled back so tightly it made her temples ache, her grey dress a uniform of perpetual mourning. The woman in the glass was a stranger. One afternoon, as a sky the color of a fresh bruise gathered in the west, the silence was broken. It was not a knock at the door or the call of a neighbor, but a sound so out of place it startled her from her mending. It was a frantic, rustling scramble in the dry leaves near the woodshed, followed by a choked sob. Esther froze, her needle poised in midair. The world outside the parsonage was not always kind. Wanderers and hard men sometimes passed through, and her father's protection, formidable as it had been, was buried with him on the hill. She placed her sewing basket on the table with deliberate care, her movements slow and measured to conceal the tremor in her hands. She walked to the window, peering through the wavy, imperfect glass. There, huddled against the rough-hewn wood of the shed, was a child. A boy, no older than 7 or 8, his dark hair matted with dirt and leaves, his deerskin leggings torn. He was a native child, Lakota from the look of him, and he was shaking, not from the cold, but from a terror so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air around him. One of his arms was clutched to his chest, and a dark stain was spreading on the sleeve of his tunic. Esther's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what her father would have done. He would have marched outside, his Bible a shield and a weapon, and ordered the boy off his property, decrying him as a heathen, a savage. The town's sentiments would have been the same. Fear and prejudice were the twin currencies of Providence Creek. To help this child was to invite scorn, suspicion, and possibly danger. But what she saw was not a heathen. She saw a terrified little boy, his eyes wide and dark like a cornered animal's. She saw the blood. The preacher's daughter, the pious woman of routine and resignation, felt something else stir within her, something fierce and protective that had long been dormant. It was an impulse that belonged not to her father's child, but to herself. She took a deep breath, unlatched the back door, and stepped out into the cold, unforgiving air. The boy, whose name was Chaitan, flinched violently when the door creaked open. He pressed himself flatter against the wood, making a small, wounded sound. Esther stopped, holding up her hands, palms open, a gesture she hoped would translate across the chasm of language and fear that separated them. "It is all right," she said, her voice softer than she had intended, husky from disuse. "I will not hurt you." He did not understand the words, but he seemed to register the tone. His terrified gaze flickered from her face to her hands and back again. Esther took another slow step forward. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, and she impatiently pushed it away. She knelt, ignoring the damp, cold earth seeping through the fabric of her skirt, trying to make herself smaller, less threatening. "You are hurt," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the stain on his arm. She pointed to it, then to herself, then gestured toward the open door of the house. It was a clumsy pantomime of offering aid, but it was all she had. For a long moment he just stared, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. Then his resolve seemed to crumble. A fresh wave of tears tracked clean paths through the grime on his cheeks, and he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Getting him inside was a delicate operation. He moved with a skittish uncertainty, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. She led him not into the formal parlor, but to the kitchen, the warmest room in the house. She sat him on a low stool near the hearth where embers still glowed from her morning fire. The silence returned, but it was a different kind now, charged with tension and the unspoken reality of their situation. His injury was a deep gash on his forearm, ugly and crusted with dirt, but it did not appear to be from a bullet. It looked as if he had caught it on a sharp branch or a piece of jagged metal during a desperate flight. Esther fetched the basin, warm water, and clean cloths. As she gently began to clean the wound, he hissed in pain, but did not pull away. He watched her every move, his dark eyes never leaving her face, searching for any sign of betrayal. She worked with a focused tenderness that surprised even herself. She had tended her father through his final illness, but that had been an act of duty. This felt different. This was a choice. As she cleaned the wound and applied a poultice of yarrow to stem the bleeding, she saw the exhaustion etched onto his small frame. He was bone-weary, running on the last dregs of adrenaline. She wrapped his arm in clean strips of linen, her movements efficient and sure. When she was finished, she offered him a cup of milk and a thick slice of the bread she had baked that morning. He hesitated, looking from the food to her face, his suspicion warring with a hunger that was painfully evident. She took a small bite of the bread herself, then pushed the plate gently toward him. That seemed to be the reassurance he needed. He ate ravenously, his small hands trembling as he brought the food to his mouth. Esther sat opposite him, watching the firelight play over his features. The fear was still there, a shadow in his eyes, but it was banked now, overlaid with a profound weariness. She saw the intricate beadwork on his worn moccasins, the small feather tied into his hair. He was not an abstraction, not a savage from her father's sermons. He was a child, someone's son, and he was utterly alone. A wave of empathy, so powerful it was almost painful, washed over her. His loneliness called out to her own, a silent recognition in the quiet kitchen. That night, she made him a bed of blankets in the small pantry, a windowless room where he might feel secure. There was no lock on the door, but she propped a chair against it from the outside. A gesture meant more for her own peace of mind than for his containment. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that he was not just lost, he was being hunted. The following day passed in a state of suspended reality. Esther went about her chores, her senses on high alert. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats, every snap of a twig like a footstep. She brought Chaitan food and fresh water, and for the first time he offered her a flicker of a smile, a brief, shy gesture that struck her with the force of a physical blow. They did not speak, could not speak, but a fragile thread of understanding was being woven between them in the silence. She learned the rhythm of his breathing, the way he would hold himself perfectly still when a floorboard creaked upstairs. He, in turn, seemed to learn the cadence of her movements, the gentle swish of her skirts as she moved about the house. Later that afternoon she made the necessary trip to the general store. The air in town was thick with a nervous energy she recognized immediately. Mr. Callahan, the proprietor, was polishing the counter with a vigor that betrayed his anxiety. "Afternoon, Miss Hale," he said, his eyes darting toward the door. "Nasty business." "Mr. Callahan," she replied, her voice even. "What business is that?" "Couple of men rode in this morning," he said, lowering his voice. "Hard types, led by a man named Vance, asking questions. About the Lakota." He paused, then added, "They're looking for a survivor, a boy. Seems there was some trouble out at the Blackwood claim. The whole family, gone. They say the boy saw it all." A cold dread washed over Esther. It was confirmation of what she had already known: Garrett Vance. She had heard the name before, whispered in connection with land disputes and missing livestock, a man who operated in the murky space between lawman and outlaw. "They believe he came this way?" she asked, fighting to keep her expression neutral as she gathered her meager supplies. "They're checking every homestead, every farm," Callahan said, shaking his head. "The sheriff went with them. More for show than anything, I reckon. That Vance has a mean look about him. Best to stay indoors, Miss Hale." Esther nodded, paid for her flour and salt, and walked back to the parsonage, her mind racing. The bubble of safety she had created around the boy had just been pierced. They were coming. It was no longer a question of if, but when. She looked at the stark, clapboard church next to her home, at the cross reaching toward the unforgiving sky. She felt no comfort there. Her father's God was a God of judgment and rules, and she was breaking all of them. The protection she sought would not come from heaven, it would have to come from her. When she returned, Chaitan must have sensed the change in her. He was standing by the pantry door, his body tense. She met his gaze and knew she could not hide the truth from him. She knelt before him, taking his small, uninjured hand in hers. "Men are coming," she said softly, knowing he would not understand the words but would feel their weight. "We have to hide, a better place." She spent the rest of the afternoon watching the road from the upstairs window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She thought of the river. The Providence Creek, from which the town took its name, curled around the back of the parsonage property. It was wide and shallow in most places, but the banks were steep and overgrown with willows and cottonwoods, their leaves now a brittle, faded gold. It was a place of wildness, a place the townspeople generally avoided. As dusk began to settle, she saw them three riders on the horizon, moving with a grim purpose. The sheriff was with them, looking uncomfortable and small next to the man she presumed was Vance, who sat his horse with an arrogant stillness. There was no more time. She grabbed Chaitan's hand. "Come," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. He looked at her, his eyes wide, but he did not resist. He trusted her. The weight of that trust was immense. She pulled her darkest, heaviest wool shawl from its hook and led him out the back door, scurrying low to the ground, using the woodshed and the overgrown fence line as cover. The air was bitingly cold now, with the damp promise of the coming night. The river was a ribbon of dark, churning silver in the fading light. The sound of it, a constant, rushing murmur, seemed to amplify the pounding of her own blood in her ears. She scanned the bank, her eyes desperate, and found a place where the current had carved out a hollow beneath the roots of a great cottonwood. The water was deeper there, shielded from the main path by a thick curtain of drooping willow branches. It was their only chance. "We must go in the water," she tried to explain with frantic gestures, pointing to the spot, then to them. He shivered, his gaze fixed on the cold, dark current. He was afraid of the water, but he was more afraid of the men. He nodded, his small face a mask of grim resolve. Esther did not hesitate. She hitched up her heavy skirts and stepped into the river. The shock of the cold was breathtaking, a physical assault that stole the air from her lungs and shot up her legs in needles of pure agony. It was far colder than she had imagined, the glacial melt from mountains 100 miles away. She bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out. She waded deeper, the current pulling at her clothes, and reached back for Chaitin. She pulled him in after her, and he gasped as the icy water swirled around his waist. She held him tight against her, his small, shivering body pressed to hers. She maneuvered them into the hollow under the bank, pulling the weeping willow branches around them like a shroud. Her heavy, dark wool skirts fanned out in the water, helping to break up their silhouettes. She stood in water up to her own waist, her arms wrapped around the boy, her back pressed against the cold, muddy earth of the bank, and they waited. The cold was a living entity. It began as a pain, a sharp, searing fire in her feet and legs. Then it transformed into a deep, consuming ache that worked its way into her bones. Her teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, and she clamped her jaw shut, praying the sound would not carry. She held Chaitin's head against her chest, trying to shield him with the last vestiges of her own body heat, murmuring wordless sounds of comfort into his hair. He was shaking too, a constant, violent tremor that she felt through her entire body. Time lost all meaning. Minutes stretched into eternities. The sky deepened from indigo to black, and a sliver of moon cast a sickly, pale light on the water's surface. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to get out, to flee the torturous cold. Her legs grew numb, then her hips, a terrifying deadness that spread upward. She could no longer feel her feet at all. She was a statue of ice, with a terrified, beating heart at her core. Then she heard them, the crunch of hooves on gravel, the low, guttural voices of men. "He can't have gone far," a voice snarled. It was Vance. The sound was close, terrifyingly close. They were on the path, just above the riverbank. "He's just a whelp, probably curled up and frozen in a ditch by now," another man said with a cruel laugh. Esther held her breath. She pressed Chaitin's face into her shoulder, her own body a shield. She could feel the boy's heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, heavy thud of her own. She prayed to a God she was no longer sure she believed in, prayed for silence, prayed for invisibility. A horse snorted directly above them. A stone, dislodged by a hoof, tumbled down the bank and splashed into the water a few feet away. Esther's entire body went rigid. Chaitin stiffened in her arms. She was certain they were discovered. She closed her eyes, a strange sense of calm washing over the terror. She had done all she could. "Nothing down there but mud and cold water," Vance's voice cut through the darkness. "Waste of time. He probably headed south, back toward his own kind. We'll ride out at first light." She heard the jingle of harnesses, the creak of leather, as the men turned their horses and rode away. Their voices faded, swallowed by the rush of the river and the vast, dark emptiness of the plains. They were gone. But Esther could not move. The release of tension left her utterly depleted. The cold, which had been a sharp enemy, was now a dull, heavy cloak, dragging her down. A profound lethargy was setting in, a dangerous, seductive warmth blooming in her chest as her body began to surrender. She knew, in a distant part of her mind, that this was how people died in the cold. You simply fell asleep. She fought it. She forced her eyes open, focusing on the moonlit ripples on the water. She thought of the boy in her arms. She could not fail him now. She tried to shift her weight, to take a step, but her legs would not obey. They were useless, alien things, trapped in the icy grip of the river. Panic began to set in, a cold, clear-headed terror that was worse than the fear of Vance and his men. They had survived the hunters, only to be claimed by the river itself. How long they stood there, she did not know. An hour, 2. The world had shrunk to the circle of her arms holding the boy and the relentless, numbing cold. She was beginning to drift, her thoughts becoming slow and syrupy, when a new sound reached her. It was not the sound of Vance's men, it was the soft, rhythmic dip of paddles in water. She lifted her head, a monumental effort. Downstream, moving with a silent, ghostly grace, were two canoes. Figures of men, their shapes dark against the moonlight on the water, knelt within them. Her first thought was that the outlaws had returned. But these men moved differently, with a quiet purpose that spoke not of plunder, but of pursuit. One of the canoes angled toward her side of the river. A man in the bow lifted a hand, and the paddling stopped. They drifted, listening. Esther's heart, which she thought had slowed to a near stop, gave a painful lurch. Chayton stirred in her arms, lifting his head. He let out a small, weak cry, a sound that was not of fear but of recognition, a name. The man in the canoe answered, his voice low and resonant, a single Lakota word that flowed like the river itself. He had been tracking them, tracking the boy, and tracking his hunters. The canoe glided closer until it nudged the bank beside her. The man, his face weathered and stern in the moonlight, looked at her. He saw the white woman, her dress soaked and dark, her face pale as bone. He saw the boy she clutched to her chest. His gaze traveled down to where she stood, rooted in the freezing water. His expression, which had been hard and wary, shifted. It was not softness, but a profound, solemn understanding that passed over his features. Without a word, he and another man slipped from the canoe into the thigh-deep water. They did not recoil from the cold. They moved toward her, and Esther felt a final, exhausted tear freeze on her cheek. She had no strength left to be afraid. One of the warriors gently took Chayton from her arms. The boy went without protest, his eyes fixed on her face, a look of silent, wrenching gratitude. The other man, the leader, put his strong hands under Esther's arms. "We have you," he said, his English slow and accented, but clear. She tried to walk, but her legs buckled instantly. They were no longer hers to command. The man lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his grip firm and impersonal, and carried her from the water. He laid her on the bank, on a thick buffalo robe that another warrior had spread on the frozen ground. The agony of returning sensation was excruciating, 1,000 burning needles pricking her flesh. They wrapped her in another dry, warm robe, the scent of wood smoke and leather enveloping her. She watched through a haze of pain and exhaustion as Chayton was passed to a man who held him with the tenderness of a father. It was his uncle, Tashunka, the stern-faced man who had carried her from the river. He spoke to the boy in low, comforting tones, and the child finally broke, his body racked with the sobs he had held back for so long. Tashunka turned back to Esther. He knelt beside her, his presence immense. He looked at her chattering teeth and her pale, drawn face. He looked at the river, then back at her. He said nothing for a long time, the only sounds the rushing water and the boy's quiet weeping. "You stood in the river," he said finally. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, weighted with awe. You stood against the cold, for him. Esther could only nod, a tiny, jerky movement. "The men who hunted him are cowards," Tashunka continued, his voice low and hard as river stone. "They will be found. What you did, that was not cowardice. That was a warrior's heart in the body of a white woman." He placed a hand briefly over his own heart, a gesture of profound respect. They did not stay long. They had to keep moving, but before they left, they built a small, efficient fire and made her drink a hot, bitter tea that sent warmth creeping back into her veins. They ensured she could stand, albeit unsteadily, on her own 2 feet before they departed as silently as they had arrived, 2 canoes swallowed by the darkness, leaving only a dying fire and the lingering scent of smoke. Esther stumbled back to the parsonage, a ghost returning to her own life. The house was cold and empty, but the silence felt different now. It was not the silence of absence, but the silence of stillness, of peace. She collapsed into her bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. In the days that followed, a change settled over her. The town of Providence Creek continued on, unaware of the life and death drama that had unfolded at its edge. They still saw the preacher's daughter, but she was no longer her father's shadow. The fear of their judgment had been scoured from her by the freezing water. She had faced a far greater trial and had not been found wanting. She had found a strength that was entirely her own, forged in the icy crucible of the river. Weeks later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the plains, a rider from a friendly trading post brought her a package. It had been left for her, he said, by a Lakota man. Inside, wrapped in soft doe skin, was a pair of exquisitely beaded moccasins, small enough for a woman, and a single perfect falcon's feather. There was no note. None was needed. Esther never saw Chayton or Tashunka again. The new preacher arrived in the spring, and she moved from the parsonage into a small cabin she bought with the last of her father's meager savings. The town still whispered, but their words were like the wind now, a sound that passed by without touching her. She had found her own ground to stand on. And the river, the site of her ordeal and her transformation, was given a new name. The Lakota, in their travels, no longer called it Providence Creek, a name that meant nothing to them. They called it Wachiwi Zitkala Wakpathe, River of the Cardinal Woman, for the dark red shawl she had worn that was the color of a steadfast heart. But the traders and the trappers who heard the name translated it more simply. They called it Brave Woman Creek. The name stuck. It was etched onto new maps, a permanent landmark of courage, a quiet, enduring testament to the preacher's daughter who had once stood in its freezing waters, and in doing so, had finally found a way home to herself.